The morning light did little to cheer the small kitchen, illuminating a countertop littered with a few crusty cereal bowls and a half-empty carton of milk. It was the kind of quiet that wasn't peaceful, but heavy. A heavy that settled deep in your bones and made you feel older than you really were. For Maria, that quiet had become her whole world since her husband passed away almost a year ago. It was a world filled with stacks of bills that grew faster than the weeds in the tiny neglected flower box outside her window. And now, sitting on the worn wooden table, was the heaviest thing of all. It wasn't a book or a keepsake. It was a single, stark white piece of paper with official-looking black letters. An eviction notice. Her fingers traced the words, but she didn't really need to read them anymore. They were burned into her memory. Final notice. The letters seemed to shout at her, accusing her. She had tried everything. She had taken on extra cleaning jobs, working late into the night, her hands raw from chemicals, only to come home and fall into an exhausted sleep for a few hours before starting all over again. She had sold her wedding ring, a painful decision that felt like tearing a page out of her own life story. But it wasn't enough. The medical bills from those last few terrible months were a mountain she could never hope to climb. And the landlord, a man who had once been patient, had finally run out of it. A small sigh escaped her lips and she looked up from the paper. Across the small living room, hunched over a coffee table that was missing a leg and propped up with a stack of old magazines, was her daughter Lena. The little girl was carefully coloring, her tongue sticking out from the corner of her mouth in concentration. She was drawing a big, bright yellow sun, a stark contrast to the gloom that filled their little apartment. Seeing her, a fierce, protective love swelled in Maria's chest, followed immediately by a wave of sickening panic. What would happen to Lena? Where would they go? The thought was so terrifying it made her feel physically ill. She had to do something. She had to fix this. Her eyes drifted from her daughter to the large, black object that dominated the far wall of their living room. The piano. It was an old upright, its once glossy black finish now faded in places, dotted with the nicks and scratches of a long life. It was too big for the small space, its presence a constant, looming reminder of a time when things were different. When their home was filled with music and laughter. It had belonged to her grandmother, a gift from her grandfather on their wedding day. He had been a carpenter, a man with hands that could shape wood into anything, but this piano was his masterpiece. He wasn't a famous maker, just a man who loved his wife and wanted to give her something beautiful. Maria could still remember her grandmother sitting on that very bench, her wrinkled fingers dancing across the yellowed ivory keys, filling her childhood home with melodies that seemed to make the air sparkle. After her grandmother passed, the piano came to her. It was the one thing she had insisted on keeping when they moved into this small apartment. It was a piece of her history, a connection to the love stories that came before her own. Her husband used to love to hear her play, even though she wasn't very good. He would say her simple, fumbling melodies were the best part of his day. And now it was Lena's turn. The little girl loved the piano. She didn't know complicated songs, but she would pick out simple, happy tunes, her small fingers pressing the keys with a gentle curiosity. It was the one place in their sad, quiet world where a little bit of joy still lived. And now, she had to kill that joy. The thought hit her like a punch to the stomach. Selling the piano felt like a betrayal. It was like selling a piece of her grandmother's soul, a piece of her husband's memory, a piece of her daughter's happiness. But the eviction notice felt like a boulder sitting on her chest, making it hard to breathe. What choice did she have? A piano couldn't keep them warm. It couldn't put food on the table. It couldn't provide a roof over their heads. Slowly, she pushed her chair back and walked over to it. She ran her hand along the smooth, cool wood, feeling the familiar imperfections under her fingertips. She lifted the lid that covered the keys, and the faint, dusty smell of old wood and felt filled her senses. She pressed one of the middle keys gently. A single, clear note hung in the silent air, a lonely sound. It was a question, and she didn't have an answer. She imagined the piano gone, the space it left behind an empty, gaping hole in the room. The silence would be even heavier then, a complete and total void. Lena looked up from her drawing. "Mama, are you going to play?" she asked, her voice small and hopeful. Maria's heart clenched so tightly it hurt. She forced a smile that felt like cracking glass. "Not right now, sweetie. I'm just looking at it." Lena accepted this and went back to her son. Maria closed the lid gently, the soft thud sounding final, like a judge's gavel. She walked back to the kitchen, her legs feeling like lead. She picked up her phone from the counter, her hand trembling so much she almost dropped it. With a deep, shuddering breath that felt like she was breathing in water, she found the number she had looked up yesterday. An antique dealer. A high-end one of those places in the fancy part of town that sold things to rich people. The man on the other end of the line had a smooth, professional voice that made her feel even more out of place. Her finger hovered over the green call button. This was it. The point of no return. Once she made this call, there was no going back. The music would stop. The history would be sold to the highest bidder. She looked at Lena, her beautiful, innocent daughter who deserved so much more than this. She looked at the eviction notice, a cold, hard reality. She closed her eyes and pressed the button. The phone rang twice before a cheerful voice answered. "Good morning, Finer Things Antiques. How can I help you?" Maria opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She had to try again. Her voice was a hoarse whisper, cracking under the weight of what she was about to do. "Hello," she managed to say. I have a piano." "For sale." The next 24 hours felt like a month. Every sound outside the apartment door made Maria's heart jump. The creak of the floorboards from the upstairs neighbor, the distant wail of a siren, the thud of the building's main door slamming shut, each one was a potential herald of her fate. She barely slept, tossing and turning on the lumpy couch. The eviction notice a dark shape on the kitchen table even in the dim moonlight. Lena, bless her heart, seemed to sense the tension and was uncharacteristically quiet, spending most of the afternoon in her room with her crayons. When the sharp, double ring of the doorbell finally came, it sounded less like a visitor and more like an order. Maria's stomach twisted into a tight knot. She smoothed down her worn jeans, ran a hand through her hair, and took a deep, shaky breath before forcing a smile and opening the door. Standing there were two men. The first one was the antique dealer from the phone, a friendly-looking man with a kind face and a soft sweater. He smiled warmly and introduced himself, but Maria barely registered his name. Her attention was completely captured by the man standing behind him. He was a different story. He was a wall of expensive fabric and cold air. He was tall and broad-shouldered, filling the entire doorway, dressed in a perfectly tailored, dark gray suit that seemed to shimmer with a subtle, expensive quality. His shoes, so black and polished they seemed to suck in the light, looked completely alien on her scuffed, faded linoleum floor. He didn't smile. He didn't even look at Maria at first. His eyes, a cool, piercing gray, immediately scanned past her, locking onto the piano in the living room with the intense focus of a predator. "Ma'am," the dealer said, his voice gentle. "This is Mr. Croft. He's the owner of the gallery. He has a deep appreciation for unique pieces." The man, Mr. Croft, gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. He finally shifted his gaze to Maria, but it wasn't a look of connection. It was an assessment, quick and clinical, like he was appraising the building, not the person standing in it. He stepped inside without being invited, his presence instantly making the small apartment feel even smaller and shabbier. A faint, expensive scent of cologne and something like old paper followed him, a smell that didn't belong. Maria felt a flush of shame creep up her neck. She suddenly saw her home through his eyes, the peeling paint on the windowsill, the stack of unpaid bills hidden under a cookbook, the worn patches on the armchair. She felt like an imposter, a poor woman playing hostess to a king. "The instrument," Mr. Croft said. His voice was low and smooth, but it held no warmth. It was the voice of someone used to giving commands and being obeyed. He walked toward the piano, his movements economical and precise. The dealer followed, offering Maria an apologetic shrug. Maria stayed by the door, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She watched as Mr. Croft circled the piano. He didn't caress the wood. He inspected it. He ran a single, perfectly manicured finger along the top. His eyes narrowed. He tapped the finish not to hear the tone, but to test for weakness. He opened the lid and stared down at the strings and hammers inside, his expression unreadable. He was looking at her grandfather's masterpiece, the vessel of her family's happiest memories, as if it were just another asset on a balance sheet. From the doorway of her room, Lena appeared, her small face peeking around the frame. She was holding her yellow sun drawing, her eyes wide with curiosity at the strangers. Mr. Croft glanced in her direction, his gaze flicking over her for less than a second before dismissing her completely. It was a look so devoid of interest that it felt colder than any glare could have been. Maria wanted to go to her daughter, to shield her from this man's coldness, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. "The soundboard is showing signs of age," Mr. Croft stated, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. He pointed to a barely visible line in the wood. "And there's some humidity damage. It will require a full restoration to be concert-ready." He pressed a key, then another. A simple chord. He didn't linger on the sound. He was just testing the mechanics. "The action is sluggish. The ivory is discolored." He pointed out a hairline crack near the pedal as if he were pointing out a fatal flaw in a business plan. Each word was a small, sharp jab at Maria's heart. He was tearing it down, piece by piece, turning her family's treasure into a list of defects. The dealer, trying to be kind, chimed in. "But it has a wonderful character, doesn't it? You can tell it was built with real care." Mr. Croft closed the lid with a soft but definitive thud. He turned to face Maria, his gray eyes locking onto hers. "Character does not pay for restoration," he said flatly. He let the silence hang in the air for a moment, a heavy, uncomfortable weight. Then he named a figure dot. It was so low, so absurdly small, that for a second Maria thought she had misheard him. The number was an insult. It was not a price. It was an evaluation of her desperation. It was enough to maybe, just maybe, pay the rent for 1 month, but it wouldn't even make a dent in the mountain of medical bills. It was the price you'd pay for a cheap, mass-produced keyboard, not for a one-of-a-kind piece of history built with love and skill. She wanted to scream. She wanted to tell him to get out of her house, to take his cold money and his cold eyes and leave. She wanted to defend her grandfather's work, to tell him about the hours he spent carving the sparrow, about the way her grandmother's eyes would light up when she played. But the fight had gone out of her months ago, worn down by grief and worry and the constant, crushing weight of being broke. What was the point? He was right. She was desperate. And desperate people don't get to negotiate. Her throat felt thick. She looked past him at Lena, who was now quietly watching them, her small brow furrowed with a confusion that broke Maria's heart. She had to do this for her. She had to take what she could get. All she could do was nod. A slow, small, defeated dip of her head. Mr. Croft gave another curt nod, as if this was the expected outcome. "We can have our movers here tomorrow," he said, pulling a fancy leather-bound planner from his inner jacket pocket. He was already done with her, already moving on to the next transaction. He jotted down a note, snapped the planner shut, and turned toward the door without another word. The dealer gave Maria a look of genuine sympathy. "We'll be in touch to coordinate," he said softly. Before following his boss out, the door clicked shut, and the silence that rushed back into the room was heavier than before. It was a silence filled with the finality of what had just happened. The deal was done. Maria stood frozen in the middle of her living room, the low, insulting offer echoing in her ears. The piano was still there, a heavy black shape in the corner, but it felt like a ghost already. The music was gone. The door clicked shut, and the silence that rushed back into the room was heavier than before. It was a silence filled with the finality of what had just happened. The deal was done. Maria stood frozen in the middle of her living room, the low, insulting offer echoing in her ears. The piano was still there, a heavy black shape in the corner, but it felt like a ghost already. The music was gone. She felt a hollow emptiness in her chest, a vast aching space where hope used to be. She looked at Lena, who had retreated back to her room, and felt a fresh wave of despair. She had failed. She had sold their history for a pittance, and it still wasn't enough to save them. Just as she was about to sink onto the couch and let the grief wash over her, there was a sharp, firm knock on the door. Maria flinched, her heart leaping into her throat. What now? Had they forgotten something? Had they come back to offer even less? She hesitated, her hand on the doorknob, before slowly pulling it open. It was the two men again. The friendly antique dealer was standing in front, a slightly awkward look on his face. Behind him, Mr. Croft stood with his back to the street, his face an unreadable mask of impatience. "My apologies, ma'am," the dealer began, shuffling his feet. "Just a small bit of business we forgot. For our records, you see. I just need the serial number from the instrument. It should be on a small metal plate inside the lid, here." He gestured toward the piano. Maria just nodded, too tired and defeated to speak. She stepped aside and let them back into her home. The air, which had just begun to feel like her own again, was once again filled with that cold, expensive scent. Mr. Croft strode over to the piano, his demeanor even more brisk and businesslike than before. He clearly considered this a frustrating waste of his valuable time. He flipped open the lid that covered the keys, the motion sharp and efficient. He leaned over, his expensive suit pulling tight across his shoulders. He pulled a slim, silver phone from his pocket and clicked on the flashlight feature, shining a bright white beam into the dusty interior of the piano. Maria watched from a distance, her arms wrapped around herself. She just wanted this to be over. Mr. Croft's hand, which had been moving with purpose, suddenly stopped in mid-air. The beam of his light froze, illuminating a small corner of the wooden frame, right beside the brass plate with the serial number. He didn't move. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, completely still, like a statue carved from ice. The dealer, noticing the sudden stillness, peered over his shoulder. "Everything all right, sir?" Mr. Croft didn't answer. He slowly lowered his phone, but his eyes remained fixed on that spot inside the piano. He leaned in closer, so close his nose was almost touching the wood. Then he reached in with his hand, his fingers, usually so steady and sure, trembling slightly as they traced something Maria couldn't see. A strange sound escaped his lips, something between a gasp and a choked breath. The change in him was so sudden and so profound that it was frightening. The icy mask of the CEO was gone, shattered into 1,000 pieces. In its place was a look of pure, unadulterated shock. His shoulders, which had been squared with confidence, seemed to slump. The hard lines of his face softened, replaced by a vulnerability Maria would have thought impossible just moments ago. He straightened up slowly, turning to face her. His gray eyes, which had been so cold and clinical, were now wide and swimming with a confusion that mirrored her own. But there was something else in them, too. A flicker of something deep and old, a ghost of a memory. "Where?" he began, his voice no longer a low, smooth command, but a hoarse, trembling whisper. "Where did your grandfather acquire this piano?" Maria frowned, completely bewildered by the sudden shift. Was this a trick? A new, cruel tactic to make her feel foolish before leaving? I told you," she stammered. "He built it. With his own hands. In a small workshop in Italy, before he and my grandmother came to this country." Julian Croft's eyes widened even further. He took a step toward her, then another, his movements no longer those of a powerful man, but of a man lost in a dream. "A workshop," he repeated softly, as if tasting the words. "In Italy." He sank down onto the piano bench, the worn wood creaking under his weight. He looked down at his hands, then back up at Maria. The tears that welled in his eyes were not of sadness, but of a dawning, unbelievable recognition. "My grandfather," he said, his voice cracking. "My grandfather was a carpenter, too. A humble man. A man who could make anything out of wood. He died before I was born. But my father, he told me stories. A single tear escaped and traced a path down his cheek. He told me his father's greatest regret was selling the most beautiful thing he ever made. A piano he built for his wife, his masterpiece. He had to sell it to pay for their passage to a new world, to give his family a chance at a better life. He looked back into the piano, his hand gesturing toward the spot where his light had been. He told me his father had a secret signature, a small symbol he carved into his very best work, a symbol only the family knew about. He looked at Maria, his eyes pleading with her to understand. A sparrow. A sparrow holding a musical note in its beak. Maria's hand flew to her mouth. She knew that carving. She had seen it 1,000 times, a tiny, almost invisible etching she had always assumed was just a decorative flourish. She had traced it with her own fingers as a child. Never knowing its true meaning, from the doorway of her room, Lena appeared again, drawn by the strange, emotional energy in the room. She walked quietly to the piano, her small presence a calming force in the middle of the storm. She looked at the tall, crying man, her head tilted to one side. Then her eyes found the tiny carving he was pointing at. She reached up with her small finger and gently traced the outline of the sparrow. Just as Maria had done, just as her great-grandfather had done a lifetime ago, the sight of the little girl's finger on the ancient symbol seemed to break something open inside of Julian Croft. He let out a shuddering breath and looked at Lena. A look of wonder and pain on his face. "Can you play?" he asked, his voice so gentle it was barely a whisper. "Something, anything." Lena looked at her mother, who gave a small, hesitant nod. The little girl climbed onto the bench next to the powerful CEO, her small frame looking tiny next to his. She placed her small fingers on the yellowed keys, and after a moment of thought she began to play. It wasn't a complicated song. It was a simple, sweet melody that Maria had taught her, a little tune that had been passed down through their family for generations. As the first few notes filled the quiet apartment, Julian's entire body went rigid. His face crumpled. He put his face in his hands, and the powerful CEO, the man of steel, was reduced to tears. They were not quiet tears. They were the deep, racking sobs of a man who had just found a lost piece of his soul in the most unexpected of places. Because the simple, beautiful melody the little girl was playing was the exact same lullaby his own father used to hum to him when he was a child. The sound that filled the small apartment was not the sound of music, but the sound of a dam breaking. It was a deep, gut-wrenching sob that seemed to come from the very center of the man on the piano bench. Maria stood frozen, her hands still covering her mouth, her mind struggling to catch up with the reality of what was happening. Just minutes ago, this man had been a statue of cold indifference, a figure of power who had treated her life's most precious possession as a flawed commodity. Now his broad shoulders were shaking, his face buried in his hands, and he was making raw, choked sounds that spoke of a pain so deep it must have been buried for decades. Lena, sitting beside him, had stopped playing. She looked at the crying man with wide, unblinking eyes, not with fear, but with a pure, simple curiosity. She didn't understand the complexities of business deals or family legacies. All she saw was a big man who was very, very sad. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out her small hand and placed it gently on his arm. It was a tiny gesture, a simple act of human kindness, but it seemed to land with the weight of an anchor in a storm. The touch seemed to pull Julian back from the edge. He slowly lifted his head, his face a mess of tears and raw emotion. He looked at Lena's small hand on his expensive suit sleeve, then up at Maria, his gray eyes red-rimmed and filled with a pleading desperation. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice thick and hoarse. "I'm so sorry." Maria didn't know what to say. What do you say to the man who just crushed your spirit and then shattered before your eyes? She could only nod, a slow, uncertain movement. He took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to compose himself. "My father," he began, his voice still unsteady. "He used to tell me this story, always before bed. It was his favorite story." He looked down at the piano keys as if they held the words he was searching for. "He said his father, my grandfather, was a poor man, but he was rich in love. He had hands that could make anything out of a piece of wood, but his greatest creation was always for his wife." Julian's gaze became distant, as if he were looking into the past, seeing a scene that had been described to him 1,000 times. He worked for a year on this piano. He would work all day at his regular job and then all night by candlelight. My father said the house was always filled with the smell of sawdust and varnish. He said his mother would bring him soup and sit with him, just watching him create this thing of beauty for her. It was his love letter to her, carved in wood and wire. He ran a hand over the keys, his touch no longer clinical but reverent. When it was finished, it was the most beautiful thing in their small village. People would come just to look at it. But then, things got hard. There was no work. There was no food. They wanted to give their son, my father, a chance at a real life. So they had to leave. And to pay for the journey, they had to sell the one thing that meant the most to them. They had to sell the piano. A fresh wave of tears welled in his eyes. My father said it broke his grandfather's heart to do it. He made the new owner promise to love it, to play it, to never let it fall into disrepair. He never saw it again. He never even knew if it made it across the ocean. It became this ghost in our family. A symbol of the sacrifice they made, the love they lost. My father spent his whole life trying to find it. He would go to antique shops, look through classifieds, always searching for a piano with a sparrow carved inside. He looked at Maria, and for the first time she saw him not as a CEO but as a son, carrying the weight of his father's unfinished quest. When he died, he made me promise to keep looking. But I didn't. I got busy. I built my own empire. I forgot about the humble beginnings. I forgot about the man who worked with his hands and loved so deeply. I became exactly the kind of man my grandfather would have been ashamed of. He looked around the small apartment, not with the disdain he had before, but with a new understanding. I saw things as assets, as numbers on a page. I came in here today and saw a flawed piece of furniture. I didn't see the love story. I didn't see the history. He turned his attention back to Lena, who was still watching him with her calm, steady gaze. "And then you played," he said, his voice cracking again. "That song, my father, he wasn't a musician. He couldn't play a note, but he hummed that same melody to me every single night when I was a boy. He said it was the only piece of music his father ever remembered, a simple folk tune from his village. It was the only thing he had left of him." The realization hit Maria with the force of a physical blow. The simple tune she had taught her daughter, a tune she had learned from her own grandmother, was a bridge that connected their two families across time and circumstance. It was a thread that had been woven through their lives, a secret they never knew they shared. The powerful CEO, the man who controlled a global empire, was now just a man who had found his way home. He looked at the worn, faded piano with a look of pure awe. "All this time," he whispered, "it was here. Being loved, being played. It was safe." He looked at Maria, his eyes filled with a profound gratitude that went far beyond words. "You kept it safe." The sobs had quieted now, replaced by a heavy, sacred silence. The three of them sat there, connected by the old piano and the simple melody that still seemed to hang in the air. Julian was no longer a buyer, and Maria was no longer a seller. They were just two people, linked by a story of love, sacrifice, and a tiny sparrow carved into a piece of wood long ago. The desperate situation had brought them here, but it was the piano and the tears of SEO that had truly brought them together. The silence in the room was a living thing. It wasn't empty or awkward. It was full, heavy with the weight of 100 years of history that had just crashed down on them. Maria watched as the man Julian slowly straightened up. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, a gesture so uncharacteristic for a man in such an expensive suit that it seemed strangely intimate. He took a deep, shaky breath, the kind of breath a person takes after nearly drowning. The hard, cold shell of the CEO was gone, and in its place was just a man. Vulnerable and raw, he stood up from the piano bench, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were learning how to use his own body again. He looked at Maria, and for the first time she saw not a powerful businessman, but a reflection of her own lost grief and confusion. He walked over to her kitchen table, his eyes falling on the stark white eviction notice that had started this whole terrible day. He stared at it for a long moment, his jaw tight. "This," he said, his voice still thick with emotion but now laced with a new, firm resolve. "This is the problem. Not the piano?" The piano was never the problem. Maria didn't know what to say. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions. She felt pity for this broken man, confusion at the sudden turn of events, and a flicker of something else, a tiny spark of hope that she was terrified to let grow. He turned away from the table and faced her fully. "The piano is not for sale," he said, his voice clear and strong, leaving no room for argument. "It was never for sale. Its value— I was a fool. I didn't understand its value. You can't put a price on a legacy. You can't buy a love story." He looked past her, at the old upright piano that had been the silent witness to all of it. "Its place is here. With you. With her." He nodded toward Lena, who was still sitting on the bench, her small hands resting quietly on the keys. Maria felt a tear slide down her own cheek. The relief was so immense it was almost painful. The piano was safe. Her family's history was safe. But the practical problem, the one that was staring at her from the kitchen table, was still there. "But the notice," she whispered, the words barely audible. "We have nowhere to go." Julian walked back toward her, but he stopped a few feet away, giving her space. He wasn't trying to intimidate her anymore. He was trying to connect. "I know," he said softly, "and I'm going to fix that. Not because I feel sorry for you. Please don't think that. I am doing this because my family owes your family a debt that can never truly be repaid. You kept this piano safe. You loved it. You let it sing. You honored my grandfather's masterpiece when my own family had lost it." He pulled his phone from his pocket, but this time he didn't use it as a tool of business. He scrolled through his contacts, his thumb moving with a new sense of purpose. "The medical bills," he said, not looking up from his phone. "The ones from your husband. They are gone. I have a team that handles things like this. They will be paid anonymously by the end of the day. You will never have to think about them again." Maria's legs felt weak. She leaned against the back of the couch for support. She couldn't process what he was saying. It was too much. It was a dream. "And the apartment," he continued, his voice calm and steady. "I own a building. It's not a fancy tower, just a simple, clean building with good light and thick walls. There's a 3-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor that's been sitting empty. It was meant for a member of my family, but they decided to stay abroad. It's yours. The rent is paid for the next 10 years. There's no catch. There are no strings attached." He finally looked up from his phone, his eyes meeting hers. They were no longer cold and gray, but warm and earnest. "I can't give you back what you lost. I can't erase your pain. But I can give you a safe place to heal. I can give your daughter a home where she doesn't have to worry. It's the least I can do. It's the only way I can begin to thank you." Tears were now streaming freely down Maria's face. These were not tears of sadness or desperation, but tears of pure, overwhelming release. The weight that had been crushing her for months, for years, was suddenly lifted. The boulder on her chest was gone. She could breathe again. Lena, sensing the shift in the room, slid off the piano bench and walked over to her mother, wrapping her small arms around Maria's legs. Maria reached down and held her daughter close, the two of them a small, trembling island of emotion in the center of the room. Julian watched them, a gentle, sad smile on his face. He slipped his phone back into his pocket. "I'll have my assistant contact you with the details. The keys, the address, everything." He started to walk toward the door, his mission accomplished. But then he paused, his hand on the doorknob. He turned back, looking almost shy. There's one thing I would like to ask," he said, his voice hesitant. "The piano and the music. It's a connection to my father I thought I'd lost forever. I don't want to intrude. I promise I won't. Would it be all right if I visited sometimes? Just to listen? To hear her play?" He looked at Lena with a look of such genuine fondness that it melted away. The last of Maria's fear and suspicion. Maria looked at the man standing in her doorway. He was no longer the terrifying CEO who had come to tear her world apart. He was a long-lost member of the family, a man who had found his way home through the music of a piano. She managed a real smile, the first one she had felt in her heart in a very long time. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I think we would like that very much." A year later, the small apartment was filled with the sound of music. It was a new apartment in the building Julian had told them about. It was clean and bright, with windows that looked out onto a small park where children played. The eviction notice was a distant memory, a ghost from another life. The piano, which had once seemed like a burden too heavy to carry, now sat proudly in the living room, its wood polished and its keys gleaming. Lena was playing a new song, a little more complex this time. Her fingers moving with a confidence that came from practice and joy. Sitting on the couch, listening with a look of pure contentment on his face, was Julian. He was not wearing a suit. He was dressed in a simple sweater and jeans. Looking more like a favorite uncle than a billionaire CEO, he visited every week, sometimes bringing new sheet music for Lena, sometimes just bringing himself, ready to listen. He had become a part of their lives, a quiet, steady presence who had helped them find their footing again. He was no longer the man reduced to tears, but a man who had been rebuilt by them, finding a richness in his life that money could never buy. The desperate situation had led them all here, to this small, happy room, tied together by the timeless magic of a piano and the enduring power of a love story that refused to be forgotten.